Welcome back to The Basement. I'm Steve Lewis. This week, I intended to return to 1965 U.S. pop culture. Then I learned about the imminent release of the spring 2025 edition of the Endless Summer Quarterly and had a chance to speak with ESQ Editor-in-Chief David Beard. So I decided to push everything back by a week to talk about Brian Wilson Productions with David, which is the focus of the last two issues of ESQ. This is the winter 2024 edition. I'm expecting spring 2025 any day now. I've had a preview. I cannot wait to get my hands on it. So without further ado, please enjoy my discussion with David Beard. So I'm here today with our old friend David Beard of the Endless Summer Quarterly, and we're here to discuss the last two issues of the Endless Summer Quarterly, winter 2024 and spring 2025. It's a two-parter concentrating on Brian Wilson Productions. It's got some great new and archival interviews with people like Cheryl Pomeroy, Victoria Hale, Dave Nolan, Marilyn and Ginger from the Honeys, Sharon Marie, Paul Peterson, Glenn Campbell, Dean Torrance. I hope that covers everybody.
I think it does, yeah.
Yeah. I want to start by asking you, one of the things that really struck me as I read the first issue was the difference in Cheryl's perception of Brian and Victoria. It was interesting to me that Cheryl, I think she said he seemed like an unhappy soul, but that she never heard anything about his father, any problems with his father, but he just seemed kind of unhappy underneath. Where Victoria found him completely fun-loving. She knew he had some problems with his dad, found him completely fun-loving. I mean, I know people are very multifaceted and can be different on different days. I thought that was interesting. I thought the one thing that they really agreed on was that Brian's life revolved around music.
I'm not sure when Brian moved out of Marie and Audrey's house to the apartment that he shared with Bob Norberg on Crenshaw Boulevard. It seems to me it would have been late 62, early 63. That's one of those unknowns. Cheryl meets Brian and he's still living at home.
Okay.
And so that might speak to that quality of Brian's personality. Victoria, she doesn't talk about Marie and Audrey's home so much as she talks about going over to the Crenshaw Boulevard apartment. And in fact, at one point, even after she's no longer even working with them, she goes out to their car and there's a note underneath her windshield that I included in the issue where Brian has left her a hand-drawn map to his new house, which is on 108th Street. And this sold to the boy in the Grand Prix.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good point. It kind of makes sense to me that at the time he was living at home, he might have been a little more of an unhappy soul and might have been less inclined to complain about his dad since he was stuck there.
It could have been an earshot, right? Or Murray could have been over looking in the room or who knows what. But
So by meeting him just a little later, it makes sense that Victoria might have had a very different experience of him living on his own.
But the same experience with Murray, because all the female singers, being Cheryl, Victoria, and then later Sharon Marie, all speak to Murray being there at the studio recordings and walking into the studio and telling them to sound younger. And his being a presence in the studio with each of those acts.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, him asking them to sound younger when they were like 18.
Well, Sharon Marie was 16.
Yeah.
What do you want me to do?
I did. He want Betty Boop. That was what I was wondering.
Murray had this constant thing in his mind. You need to sound younger. You need to sound younger. Maybe in his mind, he was thinking, you're a certain age, but I want you to sound younger. So you reach your generation and down. So we appeal to more people. Maybe that was the thought process. I really don't know.
Right. Yeah. Teenage records by teenagers for teenagers, maybe.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it was Ginger Blake who made the point, which I thought was very interesting, about Brian sort of testing some techniques and doing production and doing some experimentation with these side projects that he would later take to the Beach Boys.
Brian was constantly, as any young musician or songwriter would do, he was constantly trying to find what worked. He was exploring. It was a very explorative and transformative period in his life. He was a sponge, so he wasn't just oh, I'm working with this person now, whether it's Gary Usher or Roger Christian or Mike Love or having the guys around to Mike, everything informed Brian. In the case of The Surfer Moon, originally by Bob and Sherry, Bob Norberg and Cheryl Pomeroy, and then that's followed by The Summer Moon by Bob and Vicky, because Cheryl went off and got married. The single never happened. They must not have been thrilled with the results. And Brian was just taking and absorbing and gleaning. And then, of course, as you mentioned, Brian would take, the Beach Boys would then record in their own version of Surfer Moon. And they would take Pamela Jean and that Car Crazy Cutie. Bits and pieces of everything that he was doing would some way, somehow, more or less, be in the Beach Boys recordings.
Yeah.
Even if it was just a technique. You go back to October of '62, which I believe is his first outside the Beach Boys production, is with Gary Usher for Rachel and the Revolvers, Revolution and Number One. And this is some very different music. It's nothing like what you would expect from Brian Wilson. And it's very R&B. It's a black female recording artist. And if you talk about the Beach Boys in a generic wide umbrella term, you can say, okay, yeah, the Beach Boys are a doo-wop group. They're a pop group. You could go down the list. And then you'd say, yeah, I recognize folk because of Al. And then you'd say, yes, I recognize that they like R&B because of the Wild Honey album. But then most people, I think, would also say in that discussion, well, that's because of Carl's love of Stevie Wonder and Aretha Franklin. And that's true. People don't talk about Brian's love of R&B. And there was a genuine love there, and that shows on the Rachel and Revolvers single. So what we learned in the Sharon Marie article, jumping ahead a little bit by a year, October '63, is that Murray, and we know this from the handwritten letter from Brian to Sharon Marie in the new edition, is Brian and his father Murray were going to be a production team. This is the first time we've ever seen this before. That might have been the direction that they were heading, that they were thinking about. Murray had desires to do this, and Brian was just trying to do what his father was asking him or demanding of him. I don't know. No one knows. It's the first time anyone has seen these letters from Sharon, and I was just like, why has no one ever heard about this? Yeah. That Brian and Murray were going to be a production team. Or they were. They were a production team. And Mike Love was Sharon's manager. And we have photos. Carl Engman's, I don't know was he the A&R guy, but there's photos of Sharon, Brian, and Mike with Carl Engman. And then Dennis and Carl are in some. So this does suggest that there was some framework of an idea of one of two things. Sharon Marie was going to be with the Beach Boys. They were considering a different avenue project. She was signed to a Capitol contract. The songs she was recording were written by Brian and Mike. Run Around Lover. Her B-side of that single, October of '63, is Summertime, a Gershwin song. Points to 2010's reimagined Gershwin's album, Brian's love of Gershwin. I think that's a significant thing for Brian. Then you have, for some odd reason, her follow-up single doesn't come out until June of '64, and it's Thinking About You Baby. Again, another Brian and Mike song, which would later on go on to become Darlin' on the Wild Honey album. Again, R&B. What happens with a lot of this stuff is more questions come with it. When you get an answer, you get another question. And that happens a lot. So what we do know is that Mike was managing Sharon Marie, and Brian and Murray were her production team, and maybe they were going to be a production team with some other act. By this time, the Honeys had come into the picture, Ginger Blake and Brian's first wife, Marilyn Wilson Rutherford, and Marilyn's sister, Diane Revelle. And the Revelle's house, the parents were May and Irving Revelle. Everybody, would go over there a lot. And for Brian, it was it wasn't away out from my parents because he loved his mother dearly. It was, I'm away from my dad. This is a safe haven for me. And he would sleep on the couch sometimes. So there's a very weird kind of all these things going on at the same time. Brian absorbing. It's not just what he's doing himself, but it's also what's on the radio and what's in the when he goes down to the record store. It's complete. It's informing him. None of us can put our feet in those shoes. What we can do is just try to glean, ascertain, and discern what we can based on these firsthand accounts from these people that I've interviewed.
Glad you mentioned that Sharon Marie interview. There was so much in there that was kind of astonishing and new to me, I guess new to everybody. I really enjoyed in the first part the discussion with Dave Nolan.
Dave Nolan is one of the survivors. The survivors were Bob Norberg, Dave Nolan, Rich Illyrian, and Brian Wilson. And Brian wasn't really an official member so much as he was a producer, a collaborator, songwriter for them. He was everything behind the scene and singer. I mean, he basically was a member, but not officially. And it happened that way because Rich Illyrian helped Brian with some songs, and we're not clear on what those songs were because, according to Dave, the agreement was that Brian said to Rich, "Hey, you've helped me on these songs. Do you mind? I'm not going to give you credit, but in exchange for you helping me with these songs, I will help you get a record released." And that was kind of the buddy gentleman's agreement, handshake agreement, for if you will. And that led to Witch Stand. Go to YouTube and look up the channel Day Limbs, which is DAELIMS, which is smile ad spelled backwards. And this guy's got a great channel. There's an AI version of Witch Stand that sounds like the Beach Boys. And Dave Nolan has heard it and he loves it. And so what happened was they record Witch Stand, which is a popular place to go hang. And the story that ensues is just really wild. Dave was in the car with Brian, so he tells us the whole story of that song getting rejected and what led to Pamela Jean. It's a song that is like Dion. It's like East Coast doo-wop, and it's one of the few times that Brian ever ventured into that type of sound. But I like that he get it. Again, this is an informed moment in Brian's life. Hey, can I do this? And then, how do I do this? Mm-hmm. And then he does it. The B-side to Pamela Jean was After the Game, which is, as we learn in the interview from Dave, is not a whole lot. And it's recorded in that Crenshaw Boulevard apartment. And the details in the magazine. And I love knowing, oh, this is what we're hearing. One of the cool things was Dave Nolan, his son, Dave Nolan Jr., actually has a notebook of all these original handwritten songs by Brian in one notebook. And so that was a joy to discover. Little things like that were great surprises because one of the things I really liked about the Genesis book, The Beach Boys by the Beach Boys, was seeing Brian Wilson handwritten stuff, like the original lineup to I think it was the Surfer Girl album, one of the early albums, and how the song titles were different, and then what we would eventually have. And again, that speaks to Brian kind of just finding his way through everything on a daily basis. In the early days, Brian was just so enthusiastic, so wanting to learn the next thing. He was being transformed. He was understanding technology. His interaction with Jan and Dean was extremely important because Jan, by that time, had worked with the Wrecking Crew and was using two drummers during some of their sessions at the same time. And once Brian understood that, his whole perception of what was achievable changed. And Brian soon, in my opinion, surpassed what Jan and Dean were doing very quickly. But it's because Brian had already learned as much as he did. So meeting Jan Berry for Brian was consequential significance because of what Jan understood in the studio. Jan was a very strong arranger and quite the studio whiz. So when Brian met him, it was like, oh, look what he's doing. Look how he's doing it. And again, another big informed moment. So to this day, I think Brian's production work outside the Beach Boys is what created this foundational, successful sound. So what I set out to do with these editions of ESQ is I wanted to do a full year of Brian Wilson on the cover. Part of what happened was in February of 2024, Rolling Stone's Andy Green ran a story about the upcoming Fred Vale project, Cows in the Pasture, which is a project that Brian, like many of the things that he did in the late 60s, early 70s, is he would get interested for a few days or a day, and then he would stop being interested. And so this is the difference between early Brian and later Brian. He wanted to be home. He wanted to be in the studio or from his house, whatever circumstances, so he could create music. That was his love. That's what he wanted to keep doing. So that never changed. That was a consistency for him. In December 68, for the first time in a couple of years, Brian goes in and works with the Honeys again. Then that's followed in 69. Brian briefly, very briefly, works with Stevie Kalinich on A World of Peace Must Come. And it doesn't go very far. But there's an album's worth of tracks, but Brian's participation in those tracks is very limited. And then in 70, same type of thing happens. April of 1970, I think it was. So it's Fred Vail, same thing. Brian comes in and works a little bit, and then he's just, it's not that I don't know if he lost interest or he just, I'm not getting up and doing that today. I'm not doing that today. Because he just was a different person by the late 60s. He had gone through some stuff. And the Cows in the Pasture project is supposed to come out in the third or fourth quarter of this year. I'm excited about that project. So kind of having that in mind, the idea for these ESQs was that we would see Brian age on each cover as the time went on. So if you show your cover, my cover is Brian of 65. That's Brian of 63 on that one.
I'm looking forward to seeing Brian age as the year goes by. After doing so much work outside the group in 63, Brian's work with other acts really slowed in 64. What are your thoughts on that?
So when Sharon Marie finally releases Thinking About You Baby, June of 64, her situation with the guys stopped. And the reason it stops is because they're way far too successful to bother with anything peripherally on the outside. I'm sure in Vicky's interview, she says Brian brought her into the studio one day and they all looked at her like, what are you doing here? All of them are doing this. They've all given their lives to this. They, as a group, we know this based on Vicky's interview, and it's not unusual. And I think Cheryl even talks about this. Cheryl Pomeroy even talks about this a little, if I'm remembering correctly, that the guys, Carl or somebody was concerned that Brian was spending his time and energy outside of the group when they're thinking, well, Brian, we want you over here. We're ready. We're ready to go. Let's go. What's next? What else do you have brewing? Because they all relied on Brian, all of them.
So what's next for ESQ?
So the summer edition, which will be issue 150, our 150th issue, I really wanted to have something about Gary Usher. I looked up Stephen J. McParland's book, and I started going through that, and we just thought, oh my gosh, this stuff is so good. Coincidentally, I get an email from Stephen. So I asked him, hey, I'll do some ads for you because I think it's invaluable research. Let me do a summer edition about Gary Usher using your Gary Usher stuff. And he said, absolutely. So I am so pleased. It's basically going to be a Stephen J. McParland edition of ESQ. The stuff that Gary and Brian did together, it's a significant part of Brian's early career. That's what's going to be summer. The fall will probably be the further stuff, starting with Dean Torrance with Vegetables as the Laughing Gravy, followed by Brian working with the Honeys in December 68, followed by A World of Peace Must Come, followed by Cows in the Pasture, followed by Spring. So I've got an interview with David Sandler on Spring. I'll be conducting interviews with Steve Kalinich and Fred Vail. I've got an old article from Fred from 2010 where he wrote, it wasn't called Cows in the Pasture. So it's very interesting to me that 15 years later it now is. I don't know how that happened. Well, I'll seek to clear that up. There's a chance I may not be able to get that all into the fall edition, so it could go as far as the winter edition.
Well, thanks so much for your time and your insight and for all the groundbreaking details that are in here, things we've never seen before, details on things we've only touched on before. Couple of great issues. I'm really looking forward to what's to come, and I hope we get to talk again. Thanks so much for being here.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, David. Bye.
That's where we'll leave it for this time. Thanks for watching. I look forward to your comments. Of course, you can order your copy of Endless Summer Quarterly at esquarterly.com. Thanks again, David, and please keep up the great work. I hope you join me next week when we kick off our discussion of U.S. pop culture in the second quarter of 1965. Meanwhile, have a great week. Thanks again for watching. Bye.